couple of weeks ago, pretty much the whole state of Nebraska got a pretty significant rain or snow. And then here today and yesterday, East, West Central, and Eastern Nebraska has gotten quite a bit. However, I just looked this up the other day, or just came out the other day. This would be a long-term summer outlook, if you will, covering the months of June, July, and August. And the primary slide here is precipitation. And this is based on probabilities. And you can see over the central and northern Great Plains that the probabilities are on above 50 to 60% of being drier than normal. And in the upper right-hand corner would be the temperature. And nationwide, looks like a warm summer. And if we were looking at May, June, and July, that 3-month period, it would also look very similar. So we're going to talk some of the different annual forage options that we may use, either irrigated or dryland, of course, but I'll cover these by the different times of the year that they would be planted. And so we first look into the spring with the cool season annuals, and that being things like the oats is probably one of the more common ones people use, spring triticale, spring barley, field peas. There's several other legumes or some of the different ryegrasses. And oftentimes these can be mixed. The cereal grains like the oats and triticale, they work really well in a mixture with peas, as that's shown in the picture there. Planting dates for cool seasons, the cereals, mid-March to mid-April. Looking for a soil temperature of at least 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Here in North Platte, we're getting very close to that, and we actually are going to be planting some oats here, hopefully next week or certainly the week after. The later you go with these spring plantings, the lesser yield that you're going to be, or the lesser the yield will be. Seeding rate, that can vary quite a bit by the different types of seed you're using. Fertilization, soil test is usually best for some of the things like phosphorus and potassium, as well as nitrogen. But in general, most of these small grains as forages, 40 to 70 pounds of nitrogen would be the nitrogen would be the primary nutrient that would be getting nice response with that. Now, speaking of the seeding rate, we just finished up a study last spring. We did it both in the spring and the fall, but we had 4 different seeding rates of Goliath forage oats, and we had either 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds per acre. And now typically, general recommendations on oats are talking about 2 bushels up to 100 pounds, or 75 to 100 pounds, or even more, 120 pounds of oats per acre. But we went with those 4 increments, 25, 50, 75, and 100. We did it at 3 locations. This first one, HPAL, is at Sidney, Nebraska. NP is North Platte, Lincoln. At Sidney, or HPAL, there was a dry land seeding, no irrigation, and it was quite dry this spring, and you can see the seeding rates are quite low. Here in North Platte, we did irrigate a little bit, and at Lincoln, it was totally rain-fed. But the mean here, or the main effect of this for seeding rate, you can see that for the 50, 75, and 100 pound per acre rate, there was no significant difference between them in terms of the production. With the 25 pound per acre rate, it was significantly less, but not by much. So that was kind of surprising to see that we could get those kind of yields with some of the lighter seeding rates. And so that's just something to keep in mind if you're concerned about seed costs, or the seed might be pretty expensive. That, and I believe you can get by with this, lower seeding rates for many other species too, and not sacrifice much yield. The other main effect we looked at was, of course, different fertilizer rates, and we used either 0 or none, 30 or 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And again, just looking at the overall mean for 3 sites, there was an incremental or a linear increase in forage yield with increasing fertilizer rate. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the different small grains as using as spring forage. Oops, excuse me. We had some trials back in 2015 where we had a number of different entries, some everleaf oats, barley, a spring triticale, or 2 different spring triticale varieties, and then 4 more different oat varieties. Planted at late March. Harvest date, and this would be harvesting as if it were for hay, but we tried to do it on an equal stage of maturity, that being late milk to soft dough. The everleaf is a much later maturing variety of oat. But we saw some pretty impressive yields, almost 5 tons per acre, anywhere from 4 to 5 tons with most of those different species we looked at. So pretty tremendous yields, if you would. But just like any other crop, I think you can see a lot of year to year variability in the kind of yields that you get, just given the different growing conditions that year. And 2015 happened to be a pretty good year. As far as some of the warm season or summer annuals, so these would be late spring or summer seeded. We would have the millets, both the grazing type, which would be the pearl millet, as well as the hay types, which would be like the German, or Siberian, or white wonder. We'd have sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, straight sorghum, different cane type of species of varieties, Sudan grass, but it might also include some other less commonly used things like crabgrass, teff, some forage corns, or a few different legumes. Again, with those summer annuals, looking at a mid-May all the way up to August potential planting date. Now, warmer soil temperatures. Again, the seeding rates can vary by the species or even variety because of the variability in seed size for the different varieties and species you might have out there. In general, we've got just a general range of here potential production. So this would be under irrigated or with a pretty good rainfall like you might see in central or eastern Nebraska. But Sudan grass anywhere from 4 to 5 tons. The hybrids, sorghum Sudan hybrids or straight sorghums, 4.5 to almost 5.5 tons. Some of the shorter growing species like the foxtail millet or teff would be right around 3 to 3.5 tons per acre production. Related to that seeding date, just a couple of pictures here of a little trial we did. We had 3 different species. We planted them on July 11th and harvested, or the photo I should say is taken 48 days later on August 28th. And on the left, we have teff. The middle is a white wonder foxtail millet. And on the right, tallest one is a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. And then also we had an even later planting date, July 27th here, the same 3 species, teff, millet, and sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. And quite impressive growth for, late July seeding. The yields on those were, for those planted on July 11th, we got a little over 4 tons for the sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, and almost 2.5 tons each for the millet and the teff. And then with the late July planting, almost 4 tons on the Sudan grass and just under 3 and 2.5 for the white wonder millet and Tiffany teff. So quite impressive. And so I think it's pretty important sometimes. You might think it's too late to get some of these warm season planted, but you can go pretty late, August 1st even, and I think you get some pretty respectable yields to make it well worth your while if that forage is needed. Then we can also talk about some late summer seeded forages for fall or winter. And again, that would be the things that we might use again, or might have used in the spring, like some of the small cereal grains, peas, or turnips and other brassicas. And here we're talking late July through August planting period. Then, of course, you've got the winter hardy annuals like the winter wheat, rye, and triticale. If they're planted too early, sometimes they don't do so well, but if we're in with those by late August to September, of course, you may get some fall winter forage, but it's mostly, of course, the following spring. And we're starting to see rye and wheat greening up pretty well out here in west central Nebraska. For some of those late summer planted forages, just an example of some the production that we saw. And all of these were planted on August 13th. It was irrigated in 2012. Couldn't do much without irrigation in 2012. But anyway, harvested at the end of October. And most of these cereal grains, after what is that, 70 or so days, 60, 70 days, they would be just starting to head by late October. But anyway, 3 to 4 tons production. So again, that was quite good, I thought, quite significant, and produced a significant amount of forage. And in most cases with these late summer planted forages, we would most likely be grazing those in the fall rather than trying to hay them into cooler, late October time period. Just an example here, a picture with some cattle on oats and turnip mix, but the grazing that they were able to get off of them was 2.4 acres, 2.4 animal unit months per acre. And this was a November 1st picture. Normally, these cool season annuals need temperatures of around 15 degrees before they really start to freeze down and of course, completely lose their color and collapse. Some other possibilities, this would be in the case after wheat harvest, irrigated wheat here in west central northwestern Nebraska, where a variety of different forage cocktails or cover crop species are planted into wheat residue. So of course, wheat would be harvested in here at about mid-July. And then shortly after that, these cover crop forages interseeded into that wheat stubble. We've done other things too, where we've mixed sometimes winter and non-winter hardy cool season species. And so, for example, that's things like rye and oats, rye and turnips, a winter and a spring triticale, and so on. And the idea or objective behind this is that when we get the non-winter hardy species in there, like oats, for example, we know we're going to get much more fall growth from it compared to the rye. Then, of course, the oats is going to freeze out over winter, but the rye will be on there for the spring grazing. So just trying to grow 2 different seasons of forage with 1 planting operation. And in these cases, we generally go about half rate of each species, half of the recommended rate. Just some photos here, rye and turnips at the end of September. Turnips are doing pretty well, but the rye is still in there. Rye and oats. And just here's another thing here on planting date. In the background here, we've got a late planting, September 21st, of a variety of different cool season cereal grains. And in the foreground, an August 13th planting date. And so that's about about 5 weeks different. And you can see quite a difference in the amount of growth up to this time of the photo, which is October 8th. So in general rule of thumb here, at least for west central Nebraska, want to get those in by September 1st to produce significant fall forage. And if we're dealing with the warm season annual forages, I talked a little bit about that earlier with that one photo example, certainly by August 10th to get some significant fall forage. A little bit now I want to talk on grazing some of these annual forages. And so that's, I think, becoming more and more popular. And of course, if we're talking, some contingency plans related to drought, we are running out of our grass pasture, our native pastures, and we do have these annuals that we are going to graze. So that's what we're going to covering here. We have to keep in mind, of course, that grazing is not efficient as haying. Certainly have trampling losses, and then the grazing is interrupting plant growth or potentially damaging it. So that's going to probably or likely reduce our overall production potential. starting at an appropriate stage or height. A lot of times, particularly with those warm season annuals, they're growing so fast during the mid part of the summer. And if we don't get out there when they're anywhere from 18 to 20 feet, 24 inches tall, in a week's time, they could grow another 2 feet. So you've got to watch them closely and be ready to start the grazing. I have a table here on some of the potential stocking rates for grazing, and it's based on the potential hay yield if we were to hay it. And so this is for the early spring planted cool season annuals like the oats, triticale, or some of the winter annuals the following spring. And in most cases, I think it's a pretty safe bet that most years we could be seeing a hay potential of 3.5 tons per acre. And that translates to about almost 3 cow-calf pairs per acre for 1 month, or for a month and a half, which would be the typical grazing period if for something like oats, a month and a half, if not a little bit more, but about 2 pairs per acre for that time period. Excuse me. Now for those warm season annuals, like sudan grass, pearl millet, sorghum, sudan grass, those that regrow well, we do base this on a grazing efficiency of 40%. And what I mean by that is that we expect only about 40% of that forage to be actually consumed by the animal. The rest is usually lost to trampling. But again, let's just say, let's use a potential hay yield of 4 tons per acre. And that translates into this number of cow-calf pairs per acre, 2.75 for a month, down to about less than 1 if we were going to graze that for 3 months. So that's still pretty good amount of grazing, especially if we need it during some dry conditions that are affecting our rangeland and pastures. And one more here, this is for if we had some late summer planted cool season annuals, again, based on hay yields anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5, like I said, should be expected. We could looking at anywhere from 3 calf pairs per acre for 1 month, or a pair and a half for a 2-month period. Now, we can also work out some plans where we're using both some of these cool and warm season species in a double crop situation. Excuse me here. But on the top figure here, we're talking about spring planted cool season annuals, late March, early April. But their primary and most rapid growth is going to be occurring in mid-May through August. And if we look at the warm seasons when they're planted, say on late May, we've got a July and August period where they're growing most rapidly and producing the most forage. And then thirdly, on the bottom, if we planted some cool season annuals in the mid to late summer, we've got late August to September, the time period when they really have their most abundant and active growth. So we can put together some different field situations where we're using a combination of cool and warm season annuals in different fields, and we can have a contiguous almost period or period across the summer and into the fall where we have grazable forage at hand. So on field number 1, for example, we could have had some rye or winter annual planted the previous fall. We could be turning out there in mid to even a little earlier, first week of April. Graze that through May. By towards the end of May, that would be grazed out. Right after that, we would come in late May, early June and plant a warm season annual and have some July, August, and September grazing or growing forage at our disposal. And possibly again, after that warm season is grazed out, come in with the winter annual like rye again. But in another field 2, for example, we could have some spring planted cool season forage, late March, early April. That would be ready to graze about the 3rd week of May, graze it through June and into July. Then we had the warm season annual available in field 1, so we could move to that. Then after that, spring planted oats, for example, here was grazed out in early July. We could come right back in and plant oats again for the fall period. So just a couple examples there of different possibilities with using a combination of both. And this one just has an additional field put into play where we, in this third field, planted some cool seasons again in the spring. That could be used as grazing or haying in that primarily the June time period. And again, after that was grazed out or hayed, come in with a warm season here in mid-July, and that could be stockpiled, grazed in late fall and winter. A little bit on some of the dryland opportunity plantings, and they use that phrase opportunity plantings in the cropping world, where they're basing their decisions on what to plant given the amount of soil moisture or rainfall they've had. They'll look at some short to midterm weather forecasts to see if it's going to be worth their while to take a little bit of the risk out of planting that crop. And so, of course, obviously with cool seasons, we think about where we're at with soil moisture conditions. Like us here in Nebraska, of course, now we've had good rains anywhere from, I don't know, 3 to even 5 inches across the state. So I think it's a pretty safe bet that you could be doing some spring planted cool season annual, no problem, because that means there's enough soil moisture there. I talked with our longtime cropping system specialist here at Morph Plant the other day, and he was out actually doing some different soil probe, looking at moisture, and he was pretty confident. He was seeing moisture down to 3 and 4 feet in a lot of the fields he looked at. And then, of course, with a warm season annual, yeah, where you have to look where you're at in late May through late July, whether or not you've got the moisture there, or it looks like you've just gotten some significant rains. And the other thing, of course, with this is look at your water holding capacities of the soil you're dealing with. So, for example, a fine sand soil like the sandhills, it can hold 3/4 to an inch of moisture per foot of depth. So in other words, if you got an inch of rain in the sandhills, it's likely going to fill that top profile to 1 foot if it was completely dry before. And of course, depending on your soil type, for example, your silt loam would be the best. So it can hold 2 to 2.5 inches of water in 1 foot of depth. And as you get to the finer soils, though, like a clay, which is much smaller particles, much less porous space within that soil, you're going to be declining in the amount of water that can hold. And some other things related to that, the water use efficiency of these different forages. And so when we're talking water use efficiency, that's just the pounds of forage that is produced per inch of water. And in general, the warm seasons have the advantage there compared to the cool seasons. So things like foxtail millet, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, 2.5 to 3.5 inches of water is needed per ton of forage. Whereas those spring or cool season annuals, it's about 4.5 to 5.5 inches. However, with this, I got to looking at some average precipitations across the months. And of course, with the spring, considering that, say, April, May, and June, the probability of receiving average or above average precipitation during that 3-month time period is over 60% of the time. But in the summertime, June, July, and August, when they're trying to grow those warm seasons, the probability of being above average for that 3-month period is actually less than 50%. Just, the way the summer rains come, they're not usually as consistent as the spring rains. Oh, this is one trial we did quite a few years ago with some foxtail millet. We had 5 different irrigation levels, and planted July 1st, harvested 60 days later, but without irrigation, as a pretty dry period, 2-month period. Total rainfall, it was only 2.65, and we got less than a half a ton per acre. But with a little over 2 inches of water, and that brought the total up to just under 5, we produced a little over 2 tons. With 4.6 inches of irrigation, we were pretty well at its max, because where we got 3.52. And so really with additional irrigation beyond that 4.62 we put down, there was no, no significant increase in yield. So that was just kind of the target, or I guess this would really be the target number for that foxtail millet in terms of getting a respectable yield. Some of the risks associated with annual forages. So here in the springtime, grass tetany could come into play. That, of course, really most common occurs in the spring with these lush green forages. And if we think about these annuals like the oats, the rye or wheat you might be coming off to, they obviously really fit that category, lush and green. Magnesium supplement is recommended, and the key with this is to provide that at least 20 to 30 days before the grazing starts. So that's an important point to remember there. Nitrates is the other big issue, and this can be anytime, spring, summer, or fall. Of course, most often brought on with drought or some other stress on the plant. And then also excess nitrogen fertilizer can be an important factor with nitrates. Some other stresses, of course, might even be things like hail, or if we're dealing with, say, some spring oats, a really hard or cold freeze, hard freeze, say in almost the middle of May, that's a stressor that might trigger that response. And then lastly, prussic acid. And this is primarily in sorghum-related plants, and most common during the period of several days after the first several frosts in the fall. So got to watch out for that. And I've seen people that, excuse me, have had some cover crop mixtures with sorghums in them, a lot of other things, but there was also sorghum, and they were grazing them in late summer, early fall, and they did come across a time period where they did have a late September freeze, and of course that bothered the sorghums, but not any other species. But still, the risk was there for the prussic acid. Some of the different fall and winter grazing options with these annuals. Certainly just leaving them standing, or we call it stockpile grazing. So you'd be growing these forages in the summer into the early fall, let them freeze down, come in after they're totally dead in November, December even, and graze that standing stockpile residue, or do the practice of windrow grazing where it's cut and the windrows are just left in place, and then later in the season or fall, those windrows are directly grazed. Some data from Mary Dranowski here, and this is dealing with some oats and turnip mixtures. And this shows a couple of different dates here, the quality. And here in November, and the first one is for oats, but in November, the forages were looking like this. They had not received those really hard freezes yet, but in December, by December, they had completely ended the growing period and had basically collapsed and lost their color and turned brown. But the point of this slide here, the data, is that it did not have much effect on crude protein, NDF, like that. So the quality remains very high even after it does look like this, and they do clean it up and graze this off the ground quite well. I'm not sure why I got this slide in. That must be a mistake. But again, some of the other Late fall, grazing options. Here's some oats that was planted after wheat harvest under a pivot. And in this particular case here, using a pivot fence to allocate the grazing of the oats. And yeah, here you can see that oats, it's October 20th, and that oats is starting to head out. You know, and we talk about grazing efficiency, even by doing something like this, when we're allocating the amount of forage each day or a couple of days, you can still see where they have been grazing. There's a significant amount of trampled material there that hasn't been picked up yet. Just a few things on forages and corn residue, and people have been doing this or trying a number of things for quite a few years now, using species like turnips and radishes, oats, annual ryegrass, or even winter rye, but getting that planted into some standing corn early enough in the season where it can accumulate some pretty good growth by the time it's needed in late October or November. Some work here out of Colorado State. They had a modified planter, and on June 30th, the corn was at a V6 stage, and they interseeded these different forages into that growing corn. And so in the fall, they harvested, and so the corn stalk yield was over 3 tons per acre. But the species they interseeded, first one was annual ryegrass, and it produced 532 pounds per acre. Crimson clover didn't do so well, barely eating out there. Ryegrass plus crimson clover, 319 pounds per acre. Winter triticale, again, didn't do so well, planted that early. The brassicas, not too bad, 705 pounds. And winter triticale and brassica mixed, 382. So I think bottom line on this trial, the brassica mix probably worked the best. Annual ryegrass, you know, obviously second, not too bad, but some of the other things really weren't worthwhile or worth the effort.